Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Squash Canada's Coach PD webinar series. We're very thrilled to have two presenters today to discuss a very important topic regarding Masters athletes and basically what's so different about coaching adults. So we have a really great informative topic today, and I will let Bettina and Scott introduce themselves. But we hope you enjoy the presentation today. Just with regards to questions and whatnot, because we have a smaller group, feel free to raise your hand or unmute as we're going along, and ask Bettina and Scott any questions that you might have, or engage in the interactive conversation. You can certainly turn on your webcams and engage in today's presentation. Just keep your mics muted as we're going through unless you have a question. Otherwise, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and over to Bettina and Scott.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So we're very excited to be here today and talking with you guys. And the smaller group affords us the opportunity to hear from you as well, and for you to hear from each other, which we always think is really important in terms of gaining some information from fellow coaches who are in the same context, especially in this case, the same sport context even. So I'm excited to get started with that. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint here. Just give me a second. And there we go. So Scotty and I have been working together for about 10 years, specifically looking at the psychology and the social aspects of coaching Masters athletes. And what prompted this was the idea that when we look at so much of what's out there for coaches, it's geared around working with youth or working with high performance adults, who are on the trajectory to varsity, young adults typically on the trajectory to university or Olympics and that kind of professional sport realm. But what we don't see is we don't see how coaches might address the needs of coaching with adults in particular. And so that kind of prompted our research program around understanding how to coach Masters sport really effectively. And we think it's really important because and arguably, youth sport should be the goal of youth sport, is to eventually develop Masters athletes, because these are adults who continue to play sport for their whole lives. And ultimately that's what's so much of what we want within our sport context, is that people will continue to engage in sport lifelong. They'll do it for so many different reasons, and there are so many different benefits, health, physical health, and mental health as well. So our team, we have a website called Coaching Masters Athletes. It's here up on the screen, and this is our website as well that you can see there in the corner, the coachingmastersathletes.com. I am a Canada Research Chair in Sport Coaching and Adult Learning, and I'm an associate professor at Cape Breton University in Nova Scotia. And I'll just before I turn it over to Scotty to introduce himself, I'll also introduce one of our colleagues who's not on the line today, but who's also part of this team, Dr. Bradley Young, who's a professor at the University of Ottawa. And Scotty, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Scott. So actually, I met and actually I did my PhD with Dr. Brad Young as my supervisor. And early on, I was telling Jeff I had no knowledge of Masters athletics, didn't even know what a Masters athlete was sort of 10 years ago. And I was into coaching the high performance youth stream again. And then I met with Dr. Keller and Dr. Young, and they brought me into this world of coaching Masters athletes. And 10 years later, now I'm working at the University of Lethbridge. I actually got to update that. I just got tenure, so I realize I'm an associate professor now. Yeah, so I'm out here out west in the prairies. I am originally from Quebec, so I'm living out here and loving life. And that's my intro to me. I'm going to do the second portion of this talk, so I'm going to hand it back over to Bettina now.
Yeah, and I guess what I'll add too is that both of us have coaching experience as well. So my predominant sport that I've coached is alpine skiing, where I've coached across every level, from the grassroots entry level participants through to the World Cup athletes with our Canadian national team and our Canadian university team, and provincially with our Nova Scotia team. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about here comes from a place of understanding coaching in general. I've also coached swimming. I'm an avid masters athlete myself in triathlon, and in skiing. And so I think some of that too really gets built into what it is that we're talking about. So I'll just kind of preface it with that. So what I'll start with, and this is something that I'm really curious about what you guys think, and please feel free to lift your hand, or if you'd like, you can write in the chat. What do you think are the characteristics of an adult sport experience that show integrity, that are worthy of investing in as adult athletes, and that have a variety of different benefits? What are those characteristics that for you think are important to building your adult sport experience? And there's no right or wrong answers here, so feel free to just share.
I would say that they provide opportunities for learning, for growth. They're also challenging. Those are some of the kind of initial things that come to mind.
Yeah, definitely.
Accessibility and respect for the people at all age groups within the sport.
Yep. So we're talking about anywhere from from 35, sometimes lower age categories, all the way up to the sky's the limit. So there's a huge variety there. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, that's me. Fairness. And I say that looking at the Russian skater. Yeah, fairness in competition.
Yes, and so that brings in sort of fairness, but you also are talking about competition, and there's a lot that comes in competition as well, around understanding adults' interests and motives in competition. I see imparting current technical knowledge, so making sure that people are learning sort of the technique and tactics. But I think it's really interesting, like that you're sharing that, right? Like you're imparting that, you're bringing that into what you know into the environment, and to help the athletes to carry on a drive and a commitment. Absolutely, to be able to want to invest. And what we've seen in a lot of our research is that adults really are choosing to be part of your program. And if they aren't liking it, if they aren't feeling like they are having that drive to continue and to be committed, they'll walk away. They'll go somewhere else. They might do a different sport. They might do a different league. They might not do anything, right? So it's kind of that idea of, okay, how do we make sure that we're kind of creating something that adults want to be part of? The social aspect, or the idea that adults like to be engaged and meet new people using sport and activity. And so absolutely, this is a huge part of it as well. So there's competitive motives, there's social motives too. And sometimes people use competition as a means to develop socially, as well as a means to be part of a group, to be part of something that they're training towards, to be able to talk, to communicate about a shared goal and vision that they have in competition with with other sport participants around them. And so the social aspect can be really important, even if they're not competing. There can also be, this idea that they want to develop friendships and with like-minded people who are interested in the same sports that they are interested in. So all of these are great, right? And I think we could probably go on and on. What I'll do is I'll share with you this idea of a quality master's sport experience. Now, you might have seen the idea of quality sport experiences in general. This is sort of a term that's being used a lot in terms of trying to figure out how do we be effective coaches in developing quality sport experiences for our participants, and in particular, a quality master's sport experience. Up on the screen right now, you see that there's quality relationships. So this idea that the social is really important, the relationship that the athletes have with each other, but also the relationships that they have with you as the coach is really important. And so that's something that we have to consider as we're coaching with them. And then Lisa also added, include all levels, making all levels feel equally important. So absolutely, that goes hand in hand with this idea of the relationships. Now, we can't really assume within these relationships that they're just there for social or fun and fitness reasons, nor can we really assume that they're there just for competition or for assessing themselves. There are this variety of participatory motives, and within any group that you're coaching, you can have this huge variety. I mean, as I'm saying this, I'm wondering, do you see that within your groups that you're coaching? Do you see that you have more competitive athletes, more socially focused athletes? Where are your athletes in relation? Is it across the board, a huge variety of ages and experiences and competitive orientations, or is it more more similar? What do you guys see in your groups? Andrew, go ahead.
I didn't want to be the first person like last time to automatically assume I would just answer any questions. So I coach almost exclusively adults and have done so for the last 20 plus years. Prior to that, I did a lot of junior coaching as well, but almost exclusively in the last 20 plus years, it's coaching adults. And I can absolutely echo what you were saying, in that there are some people that are motivated and driven to improve and to see their ranking move up and to be able to beat that player that they weren't able to beat before, or to learn that, to be able to execute a particular skill in competition that they struggle with. And then there are others that seem to be on the complete opposite of the spectrum, where sometimes I feel guilty that our sessions are more about discussions about the sport, or just discussions in general that might not have anything to do with the sport. And for them, it's more about the sort of the relationship building, the camaraderie, and that sort of thing. So it's different. Some are about just challenging themselves, and not necessarily measuring up those improvements against anyone else. It's just being able to kind of look at themselves and go, okay, I feel like I'm getting better at this particular skill, and that's in itself sufficient for their own pleasure and enjoyment.
Yeah, so I think you nailed it, right? Like there's this huge variety of basically of motivational profiles that we see with master's sport. In fact, it might make the job of a master's coach harder than youth sport coaches, where there can be this more variation amongst your athletes as adults, with greater needs that need to be understood through the programming that you're delivering. And so in this, there's this article here, a blog that's down at the bottom. There's a link to that at the bottom, where we talk about this quality master sport experience that moves beyond just quality relationships to also understanding meaningful competition, the idea of testing and assessing oneself, which may or may not be related to competition, or may be understood as sort of an internal competition with oneself. The idea of mastery and of gaining skills in the sport. There's also, of course, fun and fitness that we should take into account. And oftentimes those are tied together with the idea that it is fun to develop that fitness as adults. The intellectual stimulation or the challenge that a couple of people have referred to already. The idea of feeling empowered and of feeling validated. And so what we've seen is these hallmarks are derived from interpretations that we've made on our various different research studies that we've conducted with masters athletes and with coaches of masters, really looking at the psychology of teaching and learning in adult sport. As well as sort of understanding the different motivational profiles of masters athletes and understanding coaching in general. And so if we do kind of focus in on the idea of the relationship between the coach and the athlete, some of our research has pointed towards the importance of understanding this from an adult learning perspective. So andragogy is a concept from adult learning. And the diagram here on the PowerPoint shows that there are 6 principles to andragogy. So pedagogy is more teaching children, andragogy is teaching adults, and these are the 6 principles that are involved in andragogy. And so the idea is that the learners, they want to know why they're learning something. So explaining to them why it is that you are doing certain drills might become very important. The self-concept of the learner is mature. And so they are oftentimes self-directed in their learning and more autonomous in their learning. The prior experiences of the learner need to be taken into account. If the athlete is coming in having played squash their entire lives, and they've never stopped, they've just continued on, and that's a very different experience than somebody who's decided to take up squash later in life. And so understanding those experiences, also understanding things like, is your athlete also a doctor or a physiotherapist who has a very keen understanding of the human body, or is your athlete a teacher who has a very keen understanding of teaching and learning, right? So these different understandings of their experiences become important. Their readiness to learn or their readiness to train. And if we think about that also in relation to the obligations that they have in their lives, to family, to work, and to other aspects of their life that need to be taken into account, and where training has to sort of evolve around that. Their orientation to learning, or the idea that they want to learn things that are going to help them to become better. And then finally, their motivation to learn, which is oftentimes for adults an intrinsic motivation or an internal drive to be there. And so what we've seen is that from andragogy, which is not from a sport domain, we've seen a lot of carryover into sport and into masters sport, with this idea that these 6 principles apply, and that it does depend on the situational differences and the individual learner differences therein, sort of that second outline or second ring of the diagram, and that it's really important to take into account their goals and their purposes for being there. One thing that we found was slightly different from the andragogy model that comes from education and psychology was that in sport, it's really important to take into account the competitive goals and purposes for adults' involvement, whether that's competition against others or self-competition. The other thing that we see is that there have been some age-related expectancies that happen with adults and with older adults in particular. And this can play in, our masters athletes have told us about this, especially when they have young coaches who don't necessarily know the obligations or the limitations or the possibilities that they have within what it is that they're doing. And so these are kind of things to take into account that are more related specifically to sport. And so from our research, we developed the adult-oriented coaching survey. And so the link or the reference here at the bottom can bring you to that article if you want to know more about that. And what we found was there were 5, these are grounded in adult learning principles, but more specific to master's sport in particular. And these are 5 themes that have emerged that help coaches to consider ways in which they can effectively work with master's athletes. And the first one is considering the individuality of athletes, so their experiences and motives. So you can see how some of this overlaps with the adult learning experiences that we were just talking about. Framing learning situations is the idea that that coaches can develop opportunities for athletes to discover ways in which they are moving or ways in which they can become better through sport. They can develop problem-based scenarios where they have to work through ways of doing things. They can also provide modeling either as the coach themselves or with other master's athletes around them, and assessments to allow master's athletes to understand where they are and how they can improve. Another one is imparting coaching knowledge. And this is the idea that you share with your athletes the knowledge that you have as a coach, as an athlete, as a person, and that allows you to relate to your athletes and allows them to relate to you. It also allows you to empathize with them, to inspire them, so to give different ways of creating connection with your athletes. The fourth one is respecting preferences for effort, accountability, and feedback. So here you're considering how they want to be held accountable for working hard, for giving effort, how they want to receive feedback. What we found is that through our work, a lot of coaches have said, and a lot of athletes have said, you have to know how, to whom, and when to give feedback, because various different adults want different ways of receiving that feedback. And then creating personalized programming is the idea of considering their needs and their abilities, but in terms of a season-long program and support at competitions. So when we look at these 5 factors, we're going to talk about these a little bit more, and I'd really love to have your input on these factors as we kind of move through them. But what we found is that the AOSC, the Adult Oriented Sport Coaching Survey, so these 5 themes from the AOSC, is relevant for coaches to use when they reflect on their coaching practice. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to use all of these all the time. You may think this one's really important to me, and this one I don't really use that often, and that's okay. You don't have to apply all of them all the time. You might find that if you have these in your toolbox, that at any given time, you can pull something else out. Now, I've been coaching masters athletes in skiing now for 7 years, and I have many of the same athletes still. Now, I may have them for another 20 years, 20 plus years. So I better know how to, create some novelty in what it is that I'm doing. So some of these, if you have them in your toolbox, you can always come back and use them at a later time, even if you don't want to use them right now. So just kind of thinking of these in terms of your own development as a coach can be useful. So what we'll do, and I'd love to hear from you guys, these are 3 of the items from the survey that look at considering the individuality of athletes. So I'll let you guys read them for a minute, and then I want you to think about, how do these resonate for you in particular with your group of athletes, or which one of these maybe apply to your group of athletes and how? And if you can share that with us, that would be fantastic. And you can either speak up, or you can also write it in the chat if you prefer.
Let's go with Nick first. I think I saw this.
In regards to past experiences, what's been very helpful is knowing that if you've got an athlete coming from a different sport, to find parallels in training and parallels and examples. So for example, teaching squash, I find a lot of overlap from my experiences teaching baseball, from playing baseball. So if I have an athlete who was a former baseball player, I will talk about weight shift. I will talk about stepping in. I will talk about the parallels from stepping forward and hitting and stepping forward and throwing.
Yeah, great point. So knowing their previous sporting experience and how you can draw on that to really help them to understand what it is that they're working on. That's great. Andrew.
A comment and then a question. Looking at this list, I see that probably the thing I'm maybe guilty of or do best at is the third on the list, where I am usually making a point to find out what it is that the athletes are wanting to accomplish and what their goals are, for me to kind of help better assist them in achieving those. And then the question is, what's the difference between the first two? Because they seem extremely similar to me, and I'm not quite sure what the difference is. But the other comment would be that I probably am guilty of maybe not bringing this as much when I have a discussion with the athletes.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And in many ways, the questions do overlap. There's a slight difference here because what we found is that in master's sport especially, there's a really strong emphasis on bidirectional communication or conversation. So as opposed to maybe what you have seen with younger populations, where the coach says, how did that feel? And how did that go? And what were you doing here? And we'll ask the question and then receive the response, or we'll just tell sometimes and not expect a response. I mean, asking the question is already one step up. Maybe oftentimes they say, do this, you're doing this wrong, do this. With master's athletes, they will come to you and they will say, hey, I'm having trouble with this. What should I do about it? So there's this kind of back and forth where the coach sometimes needs to ask about their previous experiences, but at other times they need to be aware that they need to just listen, right? The athletes will sometimes come to them. And so they, on the one hand, asking, and then on the other hand, listening, not just when you're asked, but also when you're not asking a question to what it is that they are saying to you. So I think that's the difference in those two questions, but it also speaks to this idea that this bidirectional communication is much more salient in master's sport than what we typically see in coaching otherwise. I'm just seeing that Denis Lepore, tough to summarize without going individual, private goals and the goals of all. So I think maybe what you're thinking is like looking at specifically at individual goals, and that might happen on a more private sort of basis as opposed to with the whole group as a whole. And universally speaking, I think fitness and warm-up is critically overlooked with adults to add to every game practice. Injury in adults is too common, and can speak for myself with this too. So yes, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to hear about that in squash, which is obviously a very physical sport, and you have to be fit. In alpine skiing, we see this as well with adults, where those who have done some fitness in the off season come with a much different developmental trajectory perhaps than those who are not fit coming into the season. And so I think, yeah, understanding the individuality of the athletes based on their fitness as well is a super important point. Thanks, Steve. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. Oh, okay. So sorry, I forgot that. So this was something I just added here. So, you know, if you think to yourself, when you look at these three items, so when you think to yourself, hey, I do those things, that's something that I do quite well, then you're probably quite good at considering the individuality of your athletes and taking into account their motives in planning, organizing, and delivering their session. But if you are thinking to yourself, hey, I could maybe do this better, then you could try to ask your athletes about their past experiences in sport or outside of sport as well, or think about their expertise when you're planning your sessions and sort of understanding what their goals are. Goal setting with masters athletes is something that sometimes doesn't occur and can occur for sure. So understanding what their goals are can be a good starting point there. So framing learning situations is the next theme. And again, I'll let you read through these three items. And I want you to think in particular, when you read that first one, using performance assessments to help your adult athletes understand why they need to learn a skill, what does that mean to you? What does the idea of performance assessments mean to you? And do you like the idea of having performance assessments? Maybe you're thinking to yourself, I don't like that. That's okay too. Talk about that too. Okay, so Jeff is saying it provides guidance on how to best teach, coach a new skill. Yeah, so it can provide guidance to you as the coach to understand where they sit, but it can also provide guidance to the athlete themselves to understand where they sit, because sometimes their perception of where they are can be different than your perception or others' perceptions of where they are. And so it can be something that can help them to better understand what they're capable of and where they can be going next. So Spider says most effective shot selection, sound technical execution. So understanding, yeah, like what's happening on a technical level, and maybe a tactical level as well in terms of shot selection. Motor skills, proper form, movement that leads to less injury potential. Yeah. And so it does relate nicely to that idea of making sure that athletes understand too where they are. Sometimes two things, either way, they could think that they're invincible and they could put themselves in danger, or they can also be too scared to try something because they've had a previous injury and they don't want to hurt themselves again. So that assessment can help them in that regard and put things in perspective, Jeff. Yeah. So when we look at this if you're thinking to yourself, I do this, then you're probably somebody who helps your athletes to discover why and what they're learning, to talk about or to show how others might do it, how the professional athletes might do it, or other excellent masters athletes might do it, to provide analogies and relate training to playing around, using performance assessments regularly and setting up competitive activities. And Denis also mentioned a bit of negative incentive, but without skills and tactics, there's no game. So yeah, so I mean, it's not even a negative incentive if it's something that helps them just to see where they are, right? You can frame it as a positive, but sometimes it can be taken as a negative by adults for sure. Scotty, you're nodding. Do you want to?
Yeah, I just some of the results we've seen in the past where the framing learning situations is the one where sometimes people will even say we've seen in some studies where there's some negative relationships with feelings of competence because it is a measure of performance and a metric where they might learn that they're not as good as they thought they were, right? So
if you think you'd like to work on this, you could try to provide some analogies for your athletes, or encourage them to watch certain game videos, provide them with examples of what they could do, and support them sort of in their assessment, and frame things in a positive way. So you need them to buy in as to why they need to learn. You know, Lisa, like that's so important, right? Is that they're not going to learn, they're not going to try if they don't believe that there's the purpose for doing that, and that there's something that they can gain from that, for sure.
I had two beginners that I got on court with, and I was telling them about preparing their racket and how important it was. And they basically looked at me and they said, we're not going to do that. They like to hold their racket like a club. And so therefore I basically had to show them why. And then the whole flavor of the lesson seemed to change beyond that. It was very difficult at the beginning, and then it became very easy after that.
Yeah. So isn't that interesting? Once they bought into it, it was like, okay, now we can go. So the next one is impart coaching knowledge. So the idea here is that you're identifying to your adult athletes how your own sport experiences has a bearing on the information that you're sharing with them, that you're sharing information from your professional development as a coach, and that you're bringing in information about what you've picked up from your sport experiences elsewhere. And so, you know, when we look at the word impart, what do we, I guess I would say, you know, why is that something that, and is impart a problem word for you, or does it make sense to you? You know, this idea of sharing your own experiences. And the reason I ask that is because we've had coaches say, oh, no, it's about the athlete. It's not about me. So I shouldn't be telling them about myself as I'm coaching them. So what do you guys think about that? Where do you see that sort of that line between self-disclosing too much and focusing on you as a coach versus sort of closing down and not telling your athlete anything about yourself? Andrew, go ahead.
So two things. My first reaction is impart is a stronger word than I would like to use. And I think maybe that's because, so I was a competitive squash athlete, and still to some extent now, but more obviously on the master's end. And I feel like there are times when I have been guilty of sharing too much of that, because I have had a lot of experience in the sport, and played it for like 45 years now. So, and been coaching for probably 35 of those years. So there's a lot of experiences and education that, you know, I think at times I've been guilty of doing too much more about me, and recognizing the value that it should be athlete-centered coaching as opposed to coach-centered. So that's why impart is a word that I'm kind of struggling a little bit at this point. So sharing when appropriate, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. So good point. So first of all, I bet you your master's athletes feel extremely fortunate to have somebody who has that kind of experience in their sport coaching them, right? And they like to know that. They kind of like to brag about that, probably even. But that said, you know, the idea with this, with imparting coaching knowledge, is really not to talk too much about yourself, but to relate to your athletes, to create credibility in who you are as a coach, and to help them be proud of who they're working with and how you can help them. I think that that's kind of where we've gone with imparting coaching knowledge, and sort of understanding this theme in particular. And so if you do this, you're likely to share your own relevant experience, your coaching knowledge, your professional development, and that can be quite inspiring to athletes. Scott's saying it speaks to your investment in them. So it speaks to the idea that you think that they are important as well. And if you think you could do better, or if you've never tried this, some coaches tell us, oh, no, I haven't ever done that before. And then they try it and they actually say, yeah, that was good. So if you haven't tried it before, I encourage you to try it. And do it in your own way, whatever makes sense to you. But you might think about bringing in some information about what you've learned, sharing a book that you've read or tips that you've received. You can also tell them about things that didn't work, right? And then how you've changed and how you've developed as an athlete yourself because of something that didn't work in the past. And the last one is about respecting preferences for effort, accountability, and feedback. And so the idea here is to consider how your adult athlete wishes to be pushed during practice, their preferences for being held responsible for working hard, and to take measures to understand what they want in terms of feedback. Now, I want to ask you guys about the word push. So, you know, what do you feel like you can push your athletes? Do you feel like maybe, and in particular, this question asks you to consider how they wish to be pushed. So for some athletes, that might mean do not push. For other athletes, that might mean, oh yeah, you know, push me to try things, because otherwise I'll hang back a little bit. So do you have any examples or anything you want to share about that? And maybe as we're doing that, I'll bring up the I do this, because that will maybe help you to think about that idea of how and when, if you push athletes, right? So if you do this, it's something that you might be able to adapt your approach nicely for understanding how each athlete wants to be pushed and show their accountability. But if you feel like you could maybe do this better, then you could spend some time figuring out how your athletes individually like to be pushed and what will get them to feel committed to the sport. What I'll do is I'll let you guys think about this one. Nothing's coming up immediately. Steve, empathetic approach really helps when giving any advice. Yeah, it immediately opens up trust. A hard workout physically isn't always the right approach in adults, and telling them conditioning on court and fitness is something they can focus on outside of sessions. So yeah, so really understanding where are they, especially this can change from day to day, right? Maybe one day they want to be pushed hard and the next day they're just there to, you know, relax and enjoy their time on the court and not have to think about anything and not have to really do anything too hard. So that's great. And then creating personalized programming. So this is the idea that you're paying attention to where your adults are in terms of their progress for the season. You're considering how to accommodate your adults when you're setting up their practice and competitive schedules, especially in regards to travel plans or work obligations or family issues. And you're pointing out to your adult athletes aspects of long-term programming and how you've tailored it to them. So when people are signing up for your sport program, are you taking into account kind of the yearly plan or the season plan for them and what that might look like? And how do you do that, I guess? Is that something that that you work on, or is that something that maybe you need to start to think about a little bit, or you'd like to start to think about in relation to their goals. Yeah, Andrew.
Sorry, I'm waiting occasionally for other people to chime in. So I would say infrequently would be my initial answer to this in terms of, how much am I paying attention to kind of a season-long plan for the athletes, and but maybe the main or the number one factor that I'm using is if it's not really during the competitive season, then I'm a little bit more willing to dive a little bit deeper to changes in technique, especially stroke technique, which can be challenging to do during the competitive season, when people, generally will struggle in a stressful environment to incorporate new technique and very quickly go back to what it was they were doing before. So that's probably the only thing really that I'm doing in terms of because a lot of the athletes that I'm working on as well aren't really on season plans. They're coming and taking lessons for a specific purpose, for a specific duration, and then some of them continue on and some of them don't.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that that's a really good point. Obviously, you have to think about your athletes and what their goal is in terms of what you're doing and what you're working with them. You can definitely, that was a really nice example of a season-long sort of thought, how you're organizing their training according to competition, taking into account when the competitions are, and then how you're preparing the athletes for those competitions. If they're doing a series of competitions, can also be ways that you're starting to think about long-term programming. Essentially, it's one that a lot of masters coaches are saying that they don't necessarily do a ton, and a lot of masters athletes are saying that they really would like it if their coaches did this more. So on that note, I'm actually going to turn it over to Scotty, because he's going to talk about some of the outcomes that we found associated with these themes, so that you can start to think through, okay, I want to work on this theme more because I want to work on that outcome with my athletes. So I'll turn it over. Oh, Scotty, do you want to, I'll change. Okay.
All right. Share screen. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Everyone sees the screen here. Okay. I just before I get in, I wanted to just say one thing on the creating personalized programming. So the first two items relate sort of to how you accommodate and plan, and that is built into coaching, right? And the third item, there's a slight nuance, and it's the telling them how, right? So a lot of coaches will do it also, but not necessarily say, oh, by the way, I've changed this because you had a change. You missed 2 or 3 practices because you had surgeries you had to attend or so, right? So just that little aspect where sometimes even the coaches, there's a discrepancy between coaches doing and athletes saying what they see, and the coach may be doing it, but they're just not vocalizing it, right? So there's that small element to it. So yeah, as Bettina alluded to, I'm just going to try and summarize over the next, what do we got, 10 minutes or so on give you some evidence for why you might want to use these different themes or different coaching approaches. And I'm going to show you some of the data from 2 studies that we collected. So we have data in one study from 402 masters athletes from a variety of different sports. Swimming, track, and rowing were the most popular ones. And we asked questions based on some of these quality sport metrics that I'm going to get into later. So this is the first study, cross-sectional, 1 time point. And then our second study, we followed athletes and coaches. So we had 103 Masters athletes and 32 coaches, again, from a variety of different sports. Swimming and skiing this time were the most popular, and we assessed them on different metrics. So what's nice about this study, although we didn't have the same number of athletes, we did have them at 2 time points. So we could sort of assess, what behaviors were working at one time in the season, what behaviors were maybe more effective at another time point in the season. And then when we see change on these variables, what's happening. All right. So as Bettina spoke about before, what we have defined, and even in looking at the chat and asking you personally what you think, a good experience for a master athlete is, we're sort of on the same page here, where it's about relationship building, meaningful competition, etc. Now, within these studies that I just showed you, we actually have data on quite a few of these outcomes. So I'm just going to share that with you. So we have it on relationships within the master sport context. We have it on mastery experiences, feeling like one is improving, feeling empowered, like one has autonomy over their own choices, feeling validated, and fun and fitness aspects related to sport. So before I get into the specifics, I'm going to show you a slide. You probably can't see all the numbers. They're very tiny, but this is a correlation matrix. And this is from our longitudinal study. On the bottom end, you have our time 1 data. And what I just want to show you here is the relationships here. So on our outcome variables, all of our different coaching strategies are showing moderate to strong and positive relationships with our positive outcomes we're looking for, and moderate negative relationships with our negative outcomes. So they're improving the things we want them to, and they're reducing the things we don't want them to. And we see very similar results on the right end. So the point of this is that when you assess them individually and independently from each other, all of these coaching practices are actually related to outcomes that enhance the master sport experience. Now, what we've done with our other studies now is we've actually put them in causal modeling or predictive modeling techniques that actually make them compete for explained variance. So we're trying to actually find out, okay, of all the ones that are showing us what these positive outcomes are, which is the best of the good ones, right? So I just want to show you that. So in times when I say, oh, no significant relationship, it doesn't mean it's not related. It just means it's not significantly better than the others. So when we talk about quality relationships, we had Jeff, I think, mentioned social aspect of it, right? And meeting new people. So we've looked at quality relationships in 2 ways. Similar to what Jeff had mentioned, we looked at general feelings. So on the far right hand side here, relatedness, right? So this was a general sense of belonging that we've assessed within the master sport context. And then we were also interested in the relationship, the personal relationship between athletes and their coaches. So how close they felt with them, the level of trust and respect they had, how committed they were, and how they intended to keep working with the same coach, and then how much they were on the same page with their coach. So they had similar ideas and cooperative behaviors. And I just want to show you some of the explained variance. So that we're pretty happy with, right? So when we look at our data on closeness, we can see that we can actually explain almost 40% of what Masters athletes tell us about being close to their coach based on our knowledge of how often they use these adult-oriented coaching principles. So that's quite a large number. When it comes to how committed they are to the coach, we can explain 63% of why they're committed to their coach, knowing solely what they're telling us about what their coaches are doing on these adult-oriented principles. And then we have roughly 40% on whether or not they see eye to eye. And in a social science context where you have 100 different reasons for being in sport and being with a coach, having these numbers so high, we're quite happy. Now we don't have data from, one thing I'll point out, when you see a silver medal, that means that it's cross-sectional data. When you see a gold medal, that means it's longitudinal data. So with longitudinal data, it's a little bit harder because you're more focused. There's less variables that could be contributing to it. So you tend to see smaller effects, but a little bit more confidence in the result. So when we have our longitudinal data, it's got a little gold medal. So we saw in a general feeling of relatedness to others, it's roughly 16-17%, right? So still a very nice number. So when we put them into models to see which ones were best, we actually found that if you're trying to develop trust and respect with your athletes and make them feel like you are on the same page, the best principles, so the ones above and beyond, the ones that are significant on their own, we're respecting the preferences for effort, accountability, and feedback. So knowing if they want to be pushed and how they want to receive feedback, and then considering who the athlete was when developing your programming. So that kind of makes sense if you're thinking about trust and respect and being on the same page, right? So understanding who they are and then treating them in a way that they want to be treated. When we're thinking about commitment, there really was a focus on personalized programming. So when they feel committed to you as a coach, it's because you've created a program that's tailored to them. And if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand anytime. You can interrupt me or type it in the chat. I'm monitoring that too. When we looked at general sense of connectedness with others in the program, we noticed, interestingly, that at the first time point at the start of the season, imparting coaching knowledge was something that made people feel connected. So telling them who you were as a coach, what your experiences are. And that kind of makes sense at the start of a season, right? People don't know each other quite well, but if you're telling them who they are, you're sharing who you are as a person, what knowledge you're bringing to them, that will develop a shared sense of knowledge, right? And then later in the season, 8 weeks later, we see that respecting preferences for effort, accountability, and feedback was contributing the strongest to a general sense of belonging. So treating people in a way that they want to be treated, providing feedback in the way that they want, made them feel more connected to others. Now, when we look at mastery experiences, Andrew spoke about different learning based challenge and growth aspects that make master sports something worth investing in, right? So we've looked at it in terms of the behaviors that make people either feel capable or feel like they aren't capable at getting better at achieving new things. So at time one, considering who the athlete was when building their programming had a positive effect on making people feel capable, and actually was significantly related to making the opposite, right? So it reduced feelings of being incapable. We looked then at time two, so 8 weeks into the season, we saw that respecting preferences for effort, accountability, and feedback, so treating them in ways that matched their feedback style, was most important in making them feel capable and reducing feelings of feeling incapable. Now, again, what's important here is it tells us that these needs exist across the season, but how you satisfy the needs is going to be a little bit different as you move on, as you get to know your athletes and as your athletes face new challenges. When we look at feeling empowered, Lisa talked about feeling important, right? And we've looked at it through the lens of feeling like one has choices, feeling like they're in control of their development, and that their own behaviors have a causal effect on their outcome. We've also looked at behaviors that make you feel not in control. So at time one, we have considering individuality of athletes, predicting whether or not people feel like they have choices, and then it reduces a feeling of not being in control. And then at time two, respecting preferences for accountability and feedback. So again, learning who your athletes are, and then later in the season, treating them and talking to them differently according We then looked at creating personalized programming, made people feel like they were in control, right? So they told you what they wanted and you've actually done it. And it makes them feel like they are a cause of their own outcomes. And then respecting their preferences for feedback was important for this as well. Now, when we look at feeling validated, we've looked at it in terms of 2 simple questions we've asked. Do you want to invest more in your sport? And are you committed to your sport? And by looking at the adult-oriented coaching principles, we're able to explain 61% of why they want to invest in sport and 22% of why they're committed to their sport over time, right? So Denis or Dennis and Jeff both mentioned aspects of commitment and lifelong and within sport, outside of sport, right? So when we look at the best predictors, creating personalized programming is very good for establishing investment. And then framing learning situations through self-discovery, challenge, and testing oneself is another way to enhance investment, to enhance commitment. There was none that rose above the rest. But again, remember that no significant relationship doesn't mean they're not related, just there was not one that was any better than the rest at producing it. And then finally, for fun and fitness, we measured whether or not they find sport enjoyable and then whether they liked going to practice. And in this, there was no one principle that was any better than the other. But again, remember that when we looked at our correlation matrix, when we assess them individually, if you're doing any one of these behaviors, they are strongly related to liking and having fun. When we looked at, sorry, that should say liking, respecting preference for effort, accountability, and effort was related to whether they liked the sport. So here, again, just because there's no significant relationship in that, what I showed you, doesn't mean they're not related, right? Okay, so just to summarize that data, basically what I'm trying to show you, or what we're trying to drive home, is the coach plays an important role in helping facilitate a quality sport experience for masters athletes. So a sport experience that athletes feel is worth their investment of time, that respects them, that allows them to feel competent, and that is worth taking time out of their busy schedules with their family and their work, right? Now, we obviously care about performance, but we go through the lens of it's more important to ensure that we're getting people in sport and that they're enjoying sport and feeling that it's worth investing in. And then the performance aspects can take care of itself through the knowledge that you're translating as coaches, right? But if people aren't in that session and aren't in that coaching environment, they're not going to be getting better, even if you have the best information, right? So having something worthwhile is the number one base or the foundation of coaching, right? So based on our evidence, we have strong evidence, especially when it comes to enhancing the relationships in the sport experience as it relates to empowering athletes and making them feel like they have control over their life and over their sport. And in terms of mastery elements, in terms of enhancing whether or not they feel like they're getting better in their domain. We also have evidence, just the cross-sectional, so not to the highest degree on liking and enjoyment, but still quite good evidence for those two metrics. So using adult-oriented coaching practices can enhance relationships between the coach and the athlete, as well as between the athletes themselves. It also gives athletes a sense of autonomy. We see evidence that it makes them like and enjoy their sport more, and they're more motivated to stay with the sport and want to continue participating with the same program and with the same coach when they're getting more of these adult-oriented coaching principles.
So I'll just jump in here. I know we're just a few minutes over past your lunch hour, perhaps. but this is the last slide. So some of the takeaways that we think you could potentially use as you kind of leave this session and start to think about what it was that we presented tonight or today, sorry, was what are 3 things that you learned about your own coaching? You know, some of the things that you said, yes, I really do that well, or hey, that was something that I could maybe work on. And how are the ways in which you could potentially use the 5 themes that we identified from the AOSC as a toolbox for your coaching, things that you might want to pull out in the future or things that you might want to pull out now. So those are sort of the takeaways that we hope that you can continue to think about as you leave our session today. And so thanks very much for coming. Our emails are here on the last slide. If you are interested in following up with us, we're happy to have a chat with you. We have a book out as well. So that's the Coaching Masters Athletes, and it goes into detail about some of the things that we talked about today as well. And you can also check out our website.
Perfect. Thanks, Bettina and Scott, for a very informative presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everybody did as well. On behalf of Squash Canada, thank you both, and to all of our participants. Just a friendly reminder that we do have a couple more Coach PD webinars coming up in April. We have a bit of a break until then. So April 5th, we do have a webinar on female athletes' health, adding the X's and O's. And then on April 19th, we've got one on developing a mindfulness practice. So certainly encourage you to register for both of those. That will likely wrap up our season for webinars for this year. But certainly, if you have any great topics, please let me know and we'll certainly consider them. Otherwise, thank you again for attending and have a wonderful day.